Hi, my name is Tanya. I'm a real alcoholic, and this is my first practice test session of the step work. So I'm doing step one and the 12 and 12, starting in the 12 and 12. I'm doing what I believe God wants me to do. I don't want to do it, but I'm doing it anyway. Here we go. Step one, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. I'm powerless over people, places, things, and situations. A lot of people will say step one is two parts and that it has two principles. They'll say it has honesty and acceptance as the principles. Although that's true, honesty and acceptance are not the spiritual principle that is attached to this step. There's a spiritual principle attached to each step. It does require honesty and acceptance, but those are not spiritual principles. The spiritual principle of step one is located at the top of page 22. We'll get there in a minute. So we admit that we're powerless and our lives have become unmanageable. When I read a paragraph, each paragraph contains one idea. The main topic of each paragraph or idea is generally the first sentence. The middle part or body of the paragraph are the supporting ideas of the paragraph, the supporting ideas that back up the main idea. And the last sentence of a paragraph is generally the summarizing sentence that wraps it all together. When the main idea is a question, like in this first paragraph, followed by an answer, that's the main topic. The question, who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one, of course, is the main idea of the first paragraph. The supporting sentences are going to tell you why, who, what, why, when, where, how. Every natural instinct cries out against the idea of personal powerlessness. That's why it's hard. I mean, raise your hand if you like feeling powerless. Nobody does. And the reason why is because our natural instincts that we're born with to protect us are going to scream out against being powerless because we never want to be in a vulnerable state. It is truly awful to admit that, glass in hand, we have warped our minds into such an obsession for destructive drinking that only an act of providence can remove it from us. It is truly awful to admit that an object that I'm holding in my hand has so much power over me that it twisted my thinking into a place where I'm killing myself and can't stop without God's help or some kind of higher power. That's the summarizing sentence. No other kind of bankruptcy is like this one, and that's because it's not this type of bankruptcy is not a financial bankruptcy, it's a spiritual bankruptcy that causes a mental and physical decline following the spiritual bankruptcy. Alcohol now becomes the rapacious creditor, bleeds us of all self-sufficiency and all will to resist its demands. Means alcohol's a rapacious creditor means when you rape something, you take it without consent. So alcohol took from me without my consent. What did it take from me without my consent? A whole lot of things, but the most important thing that it took from me or raped me of, and that's a sensitive topic for women, but was my soul. my spirit. My spirit, my soul, my body, my mind, my relationships, my life. So it took that from me, and then it takes all my willpower on top of that to resist giving in to doing whatever I got to do to get my next drink. Once this stark fact is accepted, our bankruptcy as going human concerns is complete. That means when we finally admit and accept that alcohol stole from us, we allowed alcohol to take from us our lives, our spirit, our soul, our mind, then we understand it took from us completely. It was never just one thing. Upon entering AA, we soon take quite another view of this absolute humiliation. And it is absolutely humiliating to come into Alcoholics Anonymous and say, I allowed myself to become so obsessed by this addiction that I put it ahead of everyone and everything, including my own life, to the point where I was almost dead and I was standing on death's doorstep. And that's humiliating to admit. Nobody wants to do that. But we perceive that only through utter defeat are we able to take our first steps toward liberation and strength. That's pretty self-explanatory. As painful as it is, that's the pain that's required of the first step. A lot of these steps are painful. They are ego puncturing, and it's hard to see all this stuff about ourselves all at once. We can't do it. Our admissions of personal powerlessness finally turn out to be firm bedrock upon which happy and purposeful lives may be built. So my admission of powerlessness in respecting step one is a lot different than admitting that I can't do something else. If I say, well, I just can't, um, whatever it is besides alcohol, I can't do it. That never gave me any power. That stayed me stuck in powerlessness. But when I admit this type of admission, where I admit that alcohol took everything from me, then I can start getting my power back. There's power that you get from powerlessness. If you're not getting any power in step one, and say you're not doing it right, it will tear you down and rebuild you back up. Our admissions of personal powerless finally turned out to be a solid foundation, which is what firm bedrock is. And it's going to give us happiness and purposefulness in our lives. We know that little good can come to any alcoholic. This is a new paragraph that joins AA unless he has first accepted his devastating weakness and all its consequences. That means not visiting AA, but if you're an alcoholic, you admit you're an alcoholic, you join AA, you finally say, I'm ready to go all in, I'm going to do all these steps, 100%, I'm committing myself to it, then you're joining AA. But I have to accept my devastating weakness and all its consequences. I have to admit that I am completely powerless over a substance and the consequences that follow picking up a drink or a drug. A lot are similar between us, but some are different. And so for each person, your consequences may be different than others in detail, but in the end, the consequences is the same. Jails, institutions, and death. Uh, that's where they talk about play the tape all the way through. Until he so humbles himself or herself His sobriety, if any, will be precarious. So precarious, you're teetering on the edge. Humility is required, not humiliation, but humility to admit that I'm weak in this area. I have a problem in this area. Of real happiness he will find none of all at all. Proved beyond doubt by an immense experience, this is one of the facts of AA life. And here's the principle of step 1. The principle that we shall find no enduring strength until we first admit complete defeat is the main taproot from which our whole society is sprung and flowered. The old timers called that the surrender to win principle. And a taproot is, I'm going to have to look at it because I don't know. That's why this is for practice. There's something about taproot. I think it's like a source of power. And that's why I want to look it up real quick. A straight, tapering root growing vertically downward and forming the center from which subsidiary rootlets spring. But that's the main taproot from which our whole society, so that's where we started, and that's where everything from AA comes from, this first step in this principle. When first challenged to admit defeat, most of us revolted. We ran away. We had approached AA expecting to be taught self-confidence, and that's ego. And that never worked for us, and it never will. Then we had been told that so far as alcohol is concerned, self-confidence was no good whatever. In fact, it was a total liability. I cannot depend on myself alone. I have tried to do that, and it's never worked. Trust me, I've tried for many years. I destroyed myself, trying to never ask anyone for anything, and then because I had really low self-esteem, I didn't want to ask anyone for anything. I was afraid they would say no and I wouldn't be able to handle that. Our sponsors declared that we were victims of a mental obsession so subtly powerful that no amount of human willpower could break it. That means, in this sense of being a victim, we didn't know when we started drinking that it was going to get to be such a terrible, terrible habit and a god-awful obsession. And it's a mental obsession, so the disease does start in the mind, or the main problem begins in the mind. It doesn't begin, our main problem centers in our mind, but it doesn't start in our mind. And I know people say that, but it never started in my mind. It started as a teenager. I tried it, and if I would, and it had a physical effect on me first. And then after the physical effect came the mental obsession. So sneaky, so subtle, subtly powerful, that no amount of human willpower could break it. We have to find a power greater than ourselves. So two people are more power than one. AA is a huge power. That's great in the beginning, but it's not going to last. There has to be something more than a sponsor. There has to be something more than a group. There has to be something more than a human being. It has to be something more. It has to be a different kind of power. A type of power that you may not have ever experienced before, obviously, because if I had found it before, I would have used it. I contend that I did find it, but I threw it away. There was, they said, no such thing as the personal conquest of this compulsion by the unaided will. Right, I'm not going to win alone. An unaided will is by myself. I need help. I can either accept help or I can die. Relentlessly deepening our dilemma, our sponsors pointed out our increasing sensitivity to alcohol and allergy, they called it. That means over time, my sensitivity means over time, I'm going to need more to achieve the same feelings of comfort and ease that I experienced at first, but I'll become more, my body will become more sensitive to alcohol as an allergy. So it will begin to deteriorate my body and mind exponentially over time. I get worse and worse and worse. It takes different people different lengths of time. I got very, very sick. The tyrant alcohol wielded a double-edged sword over us. First, we're smitten by an insane urge. That's the mental compulsion that condemned us to go on drinking. And then by an allergy, that's the physical cravings of the body that ensured we would ultimately destroy ourselves in the process. So our mind says, oh, we just got to have one more, one more, one more. And the allergy of the body says, that's not enough. Now I need more. Now I need. And that we're killing ourselves. And we, yeah, ends in death. Jails, institutions, or death. Few indeed were those who so assailed, attacked, had ever won through in single-handed combat, all alone in the war. It was a statistical fact that alcoholics, and they say almost never recovered on their own resources, because you can never tell an alcoholic never. They'll prove themselves the exception to the rule, but so we have to say almost. We can take the word almost out. In reality, alcoholics never recover on their own. If we recovered on our own, we wouldn't need. Recovering on my own means I don't need a medical doctor. I don't need a church. I don't need uh, friends to help me. I don't need counseling. I don't need medication. I don't need a support system. I don't need groups. I don't need steps. I don't need anything. That's the problem. We think we don't need anyone. We don't ever want to depend on anyone, and then we'll become alcoholic and we'll go lock ourselves up in a barn and die. We'd rather die than ask anybody for help. That's the part of the mental obsession. And it's an ego problem too. So alcoholics don't recover on their own resources. This had been true apparently ever since man had first crushed grapes. Next paragraph. In AA's pioneering time, none but the most desperate cases could swallow and digest this unpalatable truth. I mean, it doesn't taste good and it doesn't feel good to admit. Even these last gaspers. So we're talking about the most desperate cases and the last gaspers. You're talking about people that are at death's door and know that they need to stop but can't. Skid Row bums, the really bad alcoholics, and I put myself in that category. But even these last gaspers often had difficulty in realizing how hopeless they actually were. So in my alcoholism, even at the worst of the worst, I could not see, I could not clearly see that I was killing myself. I vaguely sensed that it was making me a little bit sick, so I needed to have a drink earlier than other people did. So maybe I couldn't make it till 5 p.m. before I drank, and I had to start at noon. But I knew it gave me energy, so I didn't understand. Over time, I got less and less energy. I had to drink more and more. But I had to have I had to have a moment of clarity. I had to have something happen where I could see that I was actually killing myself because I really didn't know. So people who are really bad alcoholics are unaware that they're killing themselves. They're not really completely aware. If they really knew what they were doing and they weren't delusional, then they would probably go to any lengths to get well. Even these last gaspers had difficulty realizing how hopeless they actually were, but a few did. A few in the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when these laid hold of AA principles, not their, what they're laying hold of are the principles of the steps. And those are hard to get a hold of. People don't really teach the principles anymore. And when they do, they're not the correct ones. They laid hold of the principles with all the fervor with which the drowning sees life preservers. They almost invariably got well. They're saying almost invariably because really there are no absolutes, but you can't really say anything in absolute to an alcoholic. That's why the first edition, what is this? The first edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, published when our membership was small, dealt with low bottom cases only. Many less desperate alcoholics tried AA but did not succeed because they could not make the admission of hopelessness. Without the admission of hopelessness, we cannot make any progress. If I did not come to the realization that I was literally killing myself with alcohol, I would not have had the will. I wouldn't have developed the willingness to do whatever I needed to do to save my life. When you realize it's a life and death issue, it changes. But I think it's interesting to me that the first book AA published before Alcoholics Anonymous, I mean, the title was actually called The Way Out. So they wanted to name the book of Alcoholics Anonymous The Way Out because we have found a way out on which we can absolutely agree and join in brotherly and harmonious action is in the chapter Into Action in the big book. And they found a way out and they wanted to let everybody know we got a way out. We got a way out. There's a way. There's another side of the tracks. There's a different way. And so they went to publish the book and found out there were, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of books titled with that same title, and decided they wanted it to be a book that no one else had ever named in order for it to stand out and be easy to find. They decided to rename it Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's how AA got its name. Didn't have a name before they wrote the book. It didn't have a name until they decided it couldn't be called The Way Out. That's how AA actually got its name. There's a way out. That's the great news that this book carries to anyone suffering. There's a way out. You don't have to keep doing what you're doing. A friend of mine likes to say, "Oh, I think you got to do what you got to do till you're done." No, you don't. You don't got to do it anymore because there's a way out. You really don't. It is a tremendous satisfaction to record that in the following years this changed. Okay. Alcoholics who still had their health, their families, their jobs, and even two cars in the garage began to recognize their alcoholism. So you don't have to get to the bottom. It says right here. As this trend grew, they were joined by young people who were scarcely more than potential alcoholics. They were spared that last 10 or 15 years of literal hell the rest of us had gone through. Wow. And step one requires an admission that our lives have become unmanageable. How could people such as these take this step? So, we're going to talk about functioning alcoholics and potential alcoholics. That's what they are. They haven't lost, they didn't lose everything they had. They weren't in Skid Row. They weren't laying in bed dying like some of us were. Uh, they hadn't destroyed in their whole lives in alcoholism. They hadn't even become a full-fledged alcoholic and they were getting sober and staying sober. And this is how. It was obviously necessary to raise the bottom the rest of us had hit to a point where it would hit them. By going back in our own drinking histories, we could show them that years before we realized it, we were out of control. That our drinking even then was no mere habit, but it was indeed the beginning of a fatal progression. Important. So we're going to show them I need to refine and perfect the ability to go back in my drinking history categorically by year and by age. So I could say, this is what I was doing at this age. This is what I was doing at this age. And this is what happened to me at this age. And so that I could show them it was a fatal progression so they can see where they are at. So they can identify and say, well, I'm at that stage that she was then. So if I continue, this is what's going to happen next. So even if they don't stop drinking and they continue and they say, well, it happened just like she said. So according to her story, if I continue going, this will be the next thing that happens unless I stop. And that's how you get them. That's how you get, that's how you raise the bottom where it hits them because they don't have to. They don't have to go through hell if they don't want to. To the doubters, we could say, perhaps, this is the fatal progression. The fatal progression means the end is death. It started as fun, categorize each step you went through. In the end, I was almost dead. To the doubters, we could say, perhaps you're not an alcoholic. Go ahead, go try some more your way. Go do it your way. No, perhaps you're not an alcoholic after all. Why don't you try some more controlled drinking? Bearing in mind, meanwhile, what we've told you about alcoholism. So the big book says, we don't like to pronounce anyone alcoholic, but you can quickly diagnose yourself, step over to the nearest bar, and practice some controlled drinking, try to drink and stop abruptly. Try this many times. It won't take very long for you to admit, if you're honest, with yourself, to tell if you are an alcoholic. You can never tell an alcoholic they're an alcoholic, but I actually had a mental health care person. I had went for uh, counseling, marriage counseling. This is how I came into AA. My husband at the time knew it was getting really bad. Anyway, he ended up in the psych ward and he got out of the psych ward and he started doing things different and going to AA. And that's how I entered AA. He took me to counseling and the woman said, well, do you drink? I said, yeah. I'm like, doesn't everybody, right? Well, how much? I said, I only drink like a couple beers at night when I come home to relax, and I might get drunk on the weekends, but no big deal. And she said, I can't help you. You're an alcoholic. And I thought, what? No one had ever told me I was an alcoholic. I cried. Even then, I think I realized it was a death sentence and I was only 30 years old. Anyway, why don't you try some more controlled drinking? Bearing in mind, meanwhile, what we've told you about alcoholism, this attitude brought immediate and practical results. It was then discovered that when one alcoholic had planted in the mind of another the true nature of his malady, sickness, that person could never be the same again. Following every spree, he would say to himself, maybe those AAs were right. After a few such experiences, often years before the onset of extreme difficulties, he would return to us convinced he had hit bottom as truly as any of us. John Barleycorn himself had been our best advocate. The attitude that I need to adopt when I'm talking to someone who is currently in their disease or who doesn't know if they're an alcoholic or not, no matter what I think, it's going to be the same attitude. And the attitude is, the big book says, you never tell an alcoholic what he must do. I think it says that in chapter to the wives, you never tell him what he must do. We are rebels in our spirit, and if someone tells me what to do, I'll prove them wrong. So instead of that, I'll say, I don't know, maybe you're not an alcoholic. I know I am. I mean, this is what happened to me. But maybe you're maybe you do better. Maybe you don't need help. Because until I went through the pain that I went through, no one was going to stop me. I had to want to stop beating my own ass. If they don't want to stop beating their ass, you can't make them. And then I dragged my ass in AA. John Barleycorn himself had been our best advocate. Alcohol and liquor will kick their ass and they'll drag in. Why all this insistence that every AA must hit bottom first? And let me go back and say, after, in that order, after we've said that, explained to them what the disease is, talked about how it's progressive, explained the different stages of alcoholism, and that if you're an alcoholic, you're going to die this way without help. After you tell them that, make sure you do your part. Then if they say, well, I'm going to go out and try some more, then you say, oh, maybe you're not an alcoholic. You might go ahead. Then you let them go. But you've got to plant the seed. That's our responsibility. When anyone, anywhere, plant the seed, I'm responsible. We don't have to really do anymore because someone who's been through the grinder with alcohol and is done hurting themselves and realize that's what they're doing, they'll be willing to do whatever it takes to climb up out of it. We really don't have to do much then. So why all this insistence that every AA must hit bottom first, which we know they don't have to hit bottom? We'll go back, page 23. Alcoholics who still had their health, their families, their jobs, 2 cars, or were potential alcoholics were spared that last 10 or 15 years of literal hell that we went through. But everybody has different bottoms. Someone could be a low bottom drunk. I'm a low bottom drunk. You could be a little bit level drunk, or you could be a high bottom alcoholic, which is called a functioning alcoholic. The answer is that few people will sincerely try to practice the AA program unless they have hit their bottom. Not mine, theirs. For practicing AA's remaining 11 steps means the adoption of attitudes and actions that almost no alcoholic who is still drinking can dream of taking. So the attitudes that I get And the actions that I take are a reflection of practicing the spiritual principles that are attached to each step. So some old timers used to say AA stands for attitude and actions, or attitude adjustment. I can't think my way into a better way of living, but I can act my way into a better way of thinking. If I take these actions, I can change my thinking. In the big book, it's only by action that we can cut off the self-will, which has always blocked the entry of God into our lives. I have to take the actions. I have to take actions every day. Who wishes to be rigorously honest and tolerant? Now it's going to go over in the next, in just a few sentences, it's going to tell you all the 12 steps. It's not going to give you all the principles, but it's an overview. So in this chapter, it is the same thing as in a paragraph. There's the main idea, all the supporting information, and the summarizing paragraph that sums it all up. Who wishes to be rigorously honest and tolerant? Rigorous implies physical exertion. It takes physical exertion to work the program of honesty and tolerance. Who wants to and who likes to do it? Nobody. We have to do it. Who wants to confess his faults to another? Not me. I don't want people to know anything about where I made mistakes at. And to make restitution for harm done. Why would I want to? Why would I want to make restitution? Well, why do I got to do that for? No one else does. Who wants to sacrifice time and energy in trying to carry AA's message to the next sufferer? Not me. I'm busy. I got things to do. I don't have time to sit here and record a video to explain to someone anything about anything. You know, I got other things to do. I could be watching a movie, taking a nap, enjoying my life. It's all about me. No, the average alcoholic self-centered in the extreme. Doesn't care for this prospect. Page 62 of the big book. Selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms. Okay. So we're selfish. We don't care for that. We don't want to do it unless he has to do these things in order to stay alive himself. So I have to work the steps. I have to do the footwork. I have to practice the principles in my life in order for me to stay alive and not kill myself with drugs and alcohol. That's what I have to do to stay alive. Normal people don't have to do that. They're fine. A little bit jealous. Okay, under the lash of alcoholism, that's the whip. Like, those Roman movies where they're whipping the chariots, the horses with a whip. That's how alcoholism whipped my ass. We're driven to AA, and there we discover the fatal, deadly nature of our situation. That's the obsession of the mind, allergy of the body, jails, institutions, and death. Then and only then do we become as open-minded to conviction and as willing to listen as the dying can be. That means until we understand that the disease of alcoholism is a deadly obsession that we will drink until we die, and we believe it, and we really know that's true, then we'll become open-minded. Then we can start listening. Because before that, if no one has knowledge of that, they don't really care. They're not going to listen. We stand ready to do anything which will lift the merciless obsession from us. That means in the how it works. It says if you want what we have and you're willing to go to any length to get it, we have to be willing to do anything. And that's going to change from day to day. My willingness today was to finally do. I mean, actually, tell you the truth, God told me He wanted me to go live and look at me. I'm an ugly old woman. I don't want to go live, and I may never add this to my YouTube video, but I'm going to start my YouTube channel, and it was good practice for me. And how does it say? I'm developing a quality of willingness that it talks about in step 3. It says, all by yourself, in the light of your own circumstances and what's going on with you in your personal life. You need to develop quality, not quantity, quality of willingness. And all the steps require sustained and personal exertion, effort to conform to their principles. And so we trust to God's will. And that's the deal. Thanks for listening. God bless you.